Okay, we are live. I am here with Kevin Doremus again. We're talking about the Wilsonian bias in international relations, particularly with regard to Russia. Would you classify yourself as more of your focus is obviously Eurasia and Russia and that
Yes.
Eastern Europe area, right? So, I'll call you an expert on Russia, actually, in regard to me, because I'm not an expert on Russia. I just went there, but anyway, I'm more of a Middle East focused person. But let's talk about the Wilsonian bias in international relations in general, and maybe want to overview that and discuss that with regard to Russia in general. We'll talk about why Woodrow Wilson is such an influencer even to this day, or kind of the embodiment of what we're talking about today. So you want to give kind of an overview of this Wilsonian bias thing?
Yeah. So let me mostly write. The United States is an embodiment of kind of a progressive liberal ideology, and it sees the world in the form of its values are universal, and kind of like how Woodrow Wilson viewed himself as, transplanting our ideas across the world, making a world safe for democracy. These ideas are just grounded within the international relations literature and also think tank literature as well, and just security analysis, and also just the foreign policy establishment in general. And the result is that due to this kind of the ideology blinding people, it prevents the analysts from seeing or understanding Russian actions, because it doesn't see Russia through its ideological prism. It views Russia through an American perspective. So, and then it assumes that democratic governments are just going to acquiesce to U.S. preferences. So, like the European Union, and what we're seeing was the Britain and France in their cooperation in the Strait of Hormuz with the United States. Another component is illiberal governments tend to be more aggressive, so we need to make the world safe for democracy. Russia, China are a giant threat to the international system, threatening global peace and global capitalism. And third, right, autocracies are corrupt and they're inefficient, and they're going to be bound to fail over time. And a result of this bias is the inaccurate assessments. And a possible remedy, as the authors of this article point out, which we'll include in the description of this video, they believe that it's important to understand historical and cultural background of Russia, but not just Russia, but if we apply it broadly, like in the Middle East, in your case, understanding the cultural context of the Middle East will help better influence foreign policy making.
Right. I have a cousin. I mean, I don't know how related this is, but I have a cousin who is, he's an American, but he kind of adopted Russian Orthodoxy as a Christian, and moved toward kind of, and it was just interesting to talk with him just in regard to the differences in thinking and studying that kind of area of history, of just the differences in thinking between the East and the West. And I think that's present here as well. And just to highlight I think the importance of this discussion is the different ideologies of Russia and the United States with regard to foreign policy. It's really important that they understand each other and be able to operate peacefully, because as we saw with the Cold War, the potential for fallout, figuratively and literally, is huge. That it's important for these two powers that are the biggest nuclear arsenals on Earth to get along at the detriment of us all if they don't. And so the theory of kind of liberal internationalism, as we talked about a little bit, of Wilson kind of create it, but it kind of is embodied in him, this idea of this technocratic management and control that the U.S. can not only lead the world, but
it has a moral obligation to do so.
Right. It has to. It is the kind of messianic world power in the sense that it has the role to be the global superpower, and it needs to set the moral agenda for, and therefore it needs to create other governments like it. So, for example, why go to war in Iraq when they haven't attacked us? Well, Saddam Hussein and his government and regime are antithetical to us. Therefore, if we remove it, it will be replaced by a democracy, and democracies will be more peaceful, more lenient, more pliable with U.S. interests. So goes the thinking, but it doesn't always work that way with the unintended consequences. So, I mean, in my opinion, I used to say Lincoln was the worst president. And I still have no love for Lincoln, but I think there, to who is the worst president, at least from our point of view, there is a correct answer. I think it's Woodrow Wilson in this idea of interventionism, especially with regard to foreign policy. Also, with regard to domestic policy, which is bad as well. But
at least he was consistent.
Yeah, I mean that is something to be said. For him, is that he believed that if the smartest people like him, being a professor and of understanding politics, writing books on these subjects, that if just the right people were in charge, that they could solve the world's issues, social, political, ideological, international. They could just solve them like a math problem. And if just the right people were given just the right amount of power, that they could fix all these things. But anyway, let's go on and talk about more of those issues in international relations. You want to comment a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's important to give this caveat that the main, when writing about international relations or any political science, it's reflective of kind of the ideological biases, political biases that are in that home country. So that's most of the literature in America in international relations are going to be from a U.S. perspective, and most of them, with a few exceptions, are going to tend to be more Wilsonian, and they claim to have universal status. Hoover Institute is an example with Michael McFaul. You have Brookings, CSIS, and other organizations. And as kind of E.H. Carr kind of quote here, the study of international relations in English-speaking countries is simply a study of the best way to run the world from the positions of strength. Right? So it's just we have this embodiment of we do everything right, they don't. So why not it's our moral prerogative to help them get out of their backwardness. So that's this. But I mean, this isn't just necessarily English speaking. I can go historically back. Even mostly a lot of Germanic people also have this belief as well. If you believe in a universal belief, they tend to have this more messianic discipleship type, unfortunately, view of the world. And to go back to your point you're making about Christianity, Andrei Sininkov, the author of this article, he wrote a book called The Dark Double, and one of the main themes of it was describing kind of the clash of Christianities, where the West is embodiment of Catholic and Protestant, where more individualistic views of humanity, where the Russians, the Orthodox, is more communal. And those kind of clashes of universal ideologies in Christianity, right, is a never-ending saga. So that part I thought was really interesting that you brought up.
Yeah, well, it's not as if either that we don't believe in universal standards of ethics or things like that. It's just the fact that we also recognize that the world is complicated and that other people in other cultures, countries, groups may not see it just the way that the West and America sees it. All we're doing is acknowledging a bias. I remember writing in international relations once about the Brookings Institute. We were supposed to analyze these different articles, and it was from Brookings, and I had heard of Brookings. I had decided to look into it a little bit more. And I looked it up on Wikipedia to give a little bit of, okay, the Brookings Institute is this, and the teacher got really upset in her comment back on my work for just saying that the Brookings Institute is left-leaning. Yeah, it's not left-leaning, it's non-biased. I'm like, but everything is biased. And that's kind of our point, that whether they're the Hoover Institute or the Brookings Institute, with regard to international relations, it's not just a left-right continuum like we're used to in the United States. It's an Eastern and Western kind of mindset in the United States that just the bias of not every country thinks everything that the U.S. does is in line with what we think, or that is, they see it the same way we do. Like, okay, well, this is a war for democracy. Well, they just may see it as a foreign invasion. They don't necessarily see it as a war for democracy. But I think that quote is telling, that in the kind of English-speaking countries, it's okay. And this is so Wilsonian as well. What's the best way to run the world?
Yes.
Positions of strength. So it's not like Finland is talking about the best way to run the world. It's that you have to be this global superpower, and then you get to dictate what the best way is to run the world. So that epistemology is important, that people just acknowledge that a bias exists. And we're saying that as well. Obviously, we have a non-interventionist view, and we think through that prism. And we think we're right just like everybody else does, but it's just what bias makes most sense of the evidence. But a lot of people just get offended at the idea that you would even suggest that they have a bias.
You're challenging, as Michael Malice would put it, you're challenging the cathedral. And that is, not tolerated, because that's essentially the myth of, the Western civilization, essentially, as it is now.
Right, exactly. That there is, that no, it's just that right-thinking people all think this way, type of thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's go on about Wilson and define this bias, his bias, or the bias that's defined by him a little bit more.
Yes, this is a technical term, but I think to kind of a more basic understanding, it's this rational constructivist belief that the regime type of a country influences its foreign policy. So going back to Wilson, if a democracy is in a state, a democratic government is going to be peaceful. Whereas a illiberal government, or a non-democracy, an autocracy, or monarchy, they're going to be more aggressive. And Senenkov, they argue that the tight, coupling of domestic ideology with foreign policy ignores kind of the historical context of Russia, because they only view things as, since Russia's in charge, they view Russian foreign policy as Putin's policy, instead of looking at it from, well, why is Russia historically doing X, Y, and Z? Instead, it's, because that government has X government, well, that means it's going to do X, Y, and Z. Instead of actually looking and researching the background of a country, they're just looking at what type of government it has. And
right. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. So essentially, when it comes to Russia, they equate that in the 90s, Russian democracy would become peaceful, and it would just acquiesce and be receptive to U.S. leadership, and it would just be integrated into the liberal order. Michael McFaul, kind of wrote about how this was like the end of Russian interventionism, and this also was a praise of Mikhail Gorbachev, that a democratic Russia will be peaceful and receptive. And the second assumption argues that an autocratic Russia would be more aggressive and reject liberal ideals. Well, this is, kind of true in the way with regarding, Putin's comments in the Financial Times saying, liberalism is now obsolete. So they would argue that this bias says that Russia is more likely to foment a narrative of Western threats at home while engaging in aggressive revisionist behavior abroad, so like invasions of Georgia and of Ukraine. And so we need to contain and transform an autocratic Russia into a liberal democracy. And then the third assumption is that Russia's corrupt and weak. It's irrelevant. So it doesn't really matter if NATO expands against Russia's, complaints, because what is Russia going to do? So Russia's just a declining power, so we can do as we like. The weak do as they must, and the strong do what they like. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that's so key, is that people think the assumptions that you brought up is that countries only behave in their foreign policy with regard to what their domestic government is. And so it eliminates the possibility in that thinking that a country can behave rationally if it has an illiberal or a bad government. So Russia is a corrupt government. The judicial system is very corrupt. All these things going on, and Putin coming to the presidency again, all these types of things. Yeah, that's there. And we recognize that. Now they see it as every time Russia does any type of action, it's because of its bad government. So Russia reacts to, for example, the overthrow of the government in Ukraine by the Obama administration, with the help of the Obama administration in 2014. And but they ignore the history of there's this East-West division in Ukraine, and there's Russian speakers in the East, and more independence, Ukrainians in the West, and there's those tensions there, and it's not just that Russia's this declining power that's going to take whatever people do to it, that you can put a nuclear arsenal or a base right on its border and it's not going to behave in rational ways. I think that's the problem. I had teachers that always told me in my undergrad that, human beings are not rational, people aren't rational. And I remember writing that if nuclear arms or something in the Middle Eastern countries got into hands of non-state actors like terrorists, that they would behave irrationally because terrorism is irrational. But over time, the thinking of rational doesn't mean that they do things that make sense to us or that are good decisions, but that they have means to end thinking and that they react to certain incentives. And that's what rationality really is. So I think that's a key point that you bring up, that it's foolish not to regard the history of what's going on in Russia and with that region. And then everything they do, that's just because it's Putin. Putin's bad. Therefore, this action, is nonsensical and evil. But it's not understanding it, having enough sympathy even to understand it coherently.
Oh, for sure. And I think to understand Russian foreign policy, you have to look back to the past, right? And from Alexander the First to, Putin now, it's essentially had two key pillars. The first is primacy within Eurasia, right? Throughout Russian history, it's been invaded by the East, West, and South. And so to prevent this, right, Russian government has decided, we have to have a strong state to defend its borders. And this has been from the czars to the communists to the post-communist governments, right? And then the other pillar is, demanding recognition and respect as a geopolitical player, right? They kind of pride themselves as being a great power they were defended when President Obama just referred to them as a regional power. Also, in their quest, they believe that the international order should be polycentric or amoral, and that means that the liberal order, right, has to go. That's why they're partnering with the Chinese to try to build a coalition of states to challenge kind of the U.S. and the European Union.
So their goal eventually then, if I understand it correctly, is to challenge the kind of liberal hegemony of the United States and its allies in kind of the NATO countries of, what we're tired of falling under this kind of unipolar system that you guys get to dictate everything about how the world's going to go and what we're going to do. Is that correct?
Yeah. They want to be they want essentially a multipolar environment where now the kind of the universalistic quests of the United States is gone, whereas the United States has its sphere of influence, Russia has its sphere of influence, and China has its sphere of influence. And then whoever becomes the regional power of the Middle East, they'll be the ones dictating the rules of the game there. That's essentially their vision.
So it's kind of their Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, just in terms of putting this in perspective for kind of an American audience, the Monroe Doctrine said, hey, this is said to other major world powers, this is our hemisphere. Stay out of kind of the northwestern hemisphere, stay out of Mexico, stay out of Hawaii, stay out of Canada. Before these were even, I mean, they were under U.S. influence, but they were not possessions of the U.S. government at this time. We didn't have, this is when America is mainly in the eastern seaboard and is pushing west, and the Monroe Doctrine is kind of stay out of our hemisphere and don't interfere here. So that's kind of what Russia and their primacy in Eurasia. Not that it was good, for the U.S. to do that either, or that it's good for Russia to do it, but to understand the reality of their goal is that they're saying, stay out of our hemisphere. And when we're paying for the government that is tinged with these neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine to overthrow the government there, and also, have a government that's more likely to allow a U.S. base right next door to Russia, they're going to see that as an obvious threat.
Yeah, and that's why they're very happy with Zelensky and his party that just, destroyed the pro-Western and the government now. Because I don't know if you know, the interview just came out with Zelensky, and he identifies himself along libertarian lines. So there's some interesting things, developing in that region. They want to have more of a dialogue with Russia.
Interesting.
Yeah,
we'll see what that actually means, because whoever calls himself a libertarian, but it was interesting because I remember in 2013-14, as the Maidan stuff was unfolding with the coup that the Obama administration was helping overthrow the Ukrainian government, and I haven't really studied it much since then, or since recently, up till that time, I should say. I remember trying to think through and process a little bit and thinking, okay, is this kind of George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams kind of overthrowing this empire and starting, kind of a liberal republic type of thing? And, should we be sympathetic to this type of, but then, realizing that that really it was a civil war between East and West Ukraine, with sides taken on the East by Russia and on the West by the United States, funding and organizing a proxy war there. So no, I'm glad to hear at least that he wants to move in that direction. What will Russia think of that?
Well, as long as there's no NATO or no European Union, they're fine with it. All they want is a buffer zone. Right. That's why, with Georgia, they took those two regions, and every day they moved the border 100 meters. So you wake up in the morning and you can see where the border fence used to be. So it's there. So for them, it's just they want a buffer zone. And also Ukraine is a battle of the oligarchs, right? Poroshenko was an oligarch, but once he lost his economic interests within Russia, he switched his economic interests to the West, and so now another oligarch that's funding Zelensky has now essentially he's kind of the puppet master of the entire thing. But we'll see how things go. There's a long way to go for sure, but there's some positive signs that the Ukrainian people are tired of, the status quo, and that whole region itself is, I think, becoming less and less. Let's say they're less and less hopeful of the pro-Western push. There's a lot of them feel like they were sold a bag of goods of, oh, if you join the West, you're going to get all this economic development, and they're now questioning where's all that investment that we were promised when we're still living on this bare minimum wage compared to Western Europe. So it's still a wait and see process, but I think Russia's very happy just to sit and wait to see how things pan out.
Yeah.
And I think for them, having a country that is more or less not pro-Russian, but not necessarily pro-West is a positive thing.
Yeah, I think they're kind of fine with that balance as far as I can see it. So let's talk about why there's still this conflict. The Cold War technically ended in 1991, we'll say, right? So there's still this, almost 30 years of, we'll call it kind of a lingering Cold War, and it's been reamped, I think, recently. Maybe you know more with regard to the 1990s, and the Bush administration seemed more focused on the Middle East. But there's this idea that for the last 2 years, almost 3 years, that the Russians stole the throne from Hillary Clinton, that it was Russian troll farms influencing people through social media to vote for Donald Trump, and that he was a puppet of the Russians. And I knew people who said this with a straight face and couldn't believe that I even had skepticism, and I didn't even vote for Trump. I just was calling the idea of those things. And then Hillary Clinton talking about what a threat Russia was all the way through the campaign, but also not just on the left, but on the right, John McCain, Paul Ryan, these people trying to. This is why they funded the Azov battalion in Ukraine in the first place. That's the group within the Ukrainian National Guard with neo-Nazi leanings and avowedly white supremacist groups that are their hit forces for the Eastern Ukrainians. Well, they said, this was, Paul Ryan said, we did all this to balance out or to fight against Russian aggression. Let's talk about that kind of renewed or continued Cold War.
So, just to go all the way back historically, Secretary John Baker, under the first Bush Senior administration, met with Gorbachev, and they had this deal where they said, when Germany unifies, NATO would not expand past the Danube. Well, then Bill Clinton comes into power, and the belief that, Russia's irrelevant, it doesn't really matter. They expanded, NATO past the Danube, included first the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, then Slovakia, some Baltic and Balkan states later. And that's when Russia at first Russian liberalism was on the rise, but when Bill Clinton did what he did, there was essentially a revolt in the Russian political elite and in the polls. Russian nationalists took power, and Yevgeny Primakov became foreign minister. And what I also was going to say, part of Russia's sphere of influence is considered anywhere where Russian Orthodoxy is. So when the United States decided to bomb Serbia, that was the last straw in any type of cooperation for the moment. And Russia then adopted a anti-Western policy. And so that's kind of like the little historical narrative building up to Putin. But I think in the article it kind of talks about not only these historical issues, but the different worldviews, kind of the Catholic Protestant influence versus Orthodoxy, and they created unrealistic expectations and misconceptions of each other's intentions. Right, from the American perspective, expansion of NATO was just help spreading liberal institutions and economic integration within the European Union. And the issue of the Balkans with Serbia was a humanitarian crisis where the Russians saw it in a much different light. They saw here's this geopolitical enemy from the past that has not gone away, is now expanding closer to its borders. And that's the key thing about Russia, is that its historical perception is rooted in its natural interest. And so if you don't understand how Russia historically is more paranoid because of historically being invaded from all sides, I think it would have probably been advised that Western powers, the expansion of the Western institutions, would have been more prudent. But unfortunately, that is not what happened.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't realize that the Clinton administration during that war with Serbia had pushed Russia through their interventionism in that Eurasian region, pushed them further away to Russian nationalism rather than liberalism, because of intervening in their sphere again post Cold War.
That's what Senenkov argues is. And I think a lot of people, a lot of like Russian academics and other people who study, Russian from a historical perspective, they say that was the last straw, because then that's where Yevgeny Primakov essentially came into the foreign ministry, and he's the one that has essentially written Putin's foreign policy. Everyone kind of says that Putin is this big opportunist. He's the mastermind, but really he's just following Primakov's playbook and dealing with the West. So that's what another part that I find really fascinating, is that really these analysts don't really understand Russia, because if they did, the man to study is not Putin, but actually Yevgeny Primakov. He's the one who he's the one who created this Eurasianist type position. It wasn't, a lot of people talk about Alexander Dugin. He's this political scientist who's kind of referred to as a drunk. He says a whole lot of crazy things, and he kind of coined the term, he kind of stole the term from Primakov of Eurasianism, and he's written a vast amount of books, and he's influenced Richard Spencer in a lot of ways. But the man that everyone should focus on instead of Dugin is Primakov. And then this you have a clash of two nationalist ideologies who believe that they're universal, right? You have the Americans who believe, who say we're indispensable, exceptional, taller than all other nations. And then you have Russia, who identifies themselves as like the inheritors of the Byzantine Empire. I kind of a little side note, like kind of to talk about the Third Rome. Just an interesting question for you. Do you know what this is a very controversial thing to say. Do you know what the capital of the first Russian state was?
What the capital of the first Russian state was?
Yes.
No, I have no idea, unless it was St. Petersburg or something.
Kiev.
Oh, Kiev. Okay.
Yeah, because, well, this is controversial. Like, who's the inheritor of Kievan Rus? That's the where the Russians believe that is their state, and the Ukrainians believe that that is their state, and that's where Russian Orthodoxy really took off, because the Archduke of the time kind of invited all these different religious leaders to the area what is now Ukraine, and he converted to Orthodoxy, and he kind of created this essentially czarist system. But it was the Mongol invasion that kind of separated what is now Russia and Ukraine, because the Mongols kind of kept the Russian territory for a few more years longer, and there was a separation, and there's always now this debate of who is the inheritor of Kiev and of Orthodoxy there. And that's why Crimea is so important. Crimea, not only is it a strategic point for Russian military base, but that's also a religious holy site where, if you're familiar with, Apostle Andrew going up the Dnieper River, when he finally landed in that region, he landed in Crimea, what is known now as Crimea. So there's also a historical and religious aspect to this as well.
Yeah, so I mean, but that's the history we don't hear, right? Whenever there's some sort of Russian action in Crimea or Ukraine or something like that, it's that background isn't given. Not that it's right, but it's just support the idea of a peaceful separation and secession. But just understanding Russia's not this adventuristic expansionist power trying to take these regions. It didn't even attempt to take back eastern Ukraine in 2014, when a lot of the pro-Russian separatists would have been okay with it, would have invited that. But yeah, I mean, so it is important, I think, as you bring out, to study it just like as with the Middle East, to study it as a region, because I think often one of the things of our Western thinking is we think in terms of the modern nation state. So we think of the United States of America, and that has the borders that you can look at on a map. However, with Russia, it's more complicated. There's more history of land that has changed hands over time.
No, and it's also a multinational, what you could say a multinational empire, right? Because it is Slavs, Caucasians, Asians, Muslims. This is a vast variety of people that live in that country, and then that's what makes Slavic studies so interesting. It's the most ethnically diverse ethnic group, and also a very ethnically decentralized group, where Germans are all more or less consolidated, French consolidated, Spaniards more or less under Spain, but here in the Slavic area it's just all these little states, and Russia as well. So to me, this whole region is so fascinating, and how historically that developed.
And that is kind of interesting. I mean, not ethnically, but I mean, the United States Americans are a very diverse group as well. I think that's interesting to maybe draw that connection a little bit between Slavic people as an ethnic identity, but also very broad, very diverse. But it's kind of funny, Americans are not an ethnic identity, but likewise a diverse group that spreads the world.
Yeah, and they're because they're more or less kind of descendants of kind of the Kievan Rus territory, and it's kind of debatable. They're always treated as the other. Like there's an article from like the London School of Economics that refers to kind of Slavs as the incomplete Europeans. So it's a very interesting, but also like you read Karl Marx and Engels, their opinion of Slavs, and it would make Hitler blush. But so this clash of these two different groups and their universal ideologies. But the main other point of the article was discussing why. Here's examples of how the U.S. is constantly being confused. They have certain expectations, but then the outcome is completely different than what they expected. Right. So, I mean, it's just always, oh, we're just surprised at what happened, right? Like the mid-1990s, oh, they're adopting more liberalism. However, right, Russia tends to be more defensive, right? This is the period kind of when the Balkans were kind of imploding, Yugoslavia was imploding, and there are civil wars, and this is the time when Primakov enters power. Then in the mid-2000s, Russia, like it was expected to Russia to be more defensive. It was an autocracy. However, right, if we remember after 9/11, Russia offered, some level of cooperation with George Bush in assisting in terrorism. However, then after the financial crisis 2008, Russia then kind of did a heel turn and intervened in Georgia when it feared Georgia would enter the NATO. And then another expectation was defensiveness and a weak autocracy, but then the outcome again was Russian assertiveness, where it would intervene in Ukraine and Syria, and because again, in their mind, they're trying to defend their national interests. Of course, as you already talked about with Ukraine, they don't want to have an enemy on their border, a historical enemy. And in the case of Syria, they do not want to have terrorists going into the Caucasus and creating trouble like they had in the early 2000s, right? Because in the 1970s, when they invaded Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a lot of these radical jihadis went into the Caucasus and helped assist in the quest for independence in Chechnya, and participated in terrorist attacks, whether Moscow Theater or the Beslan School.
Yeah,
so Russia wants to not have that again. And Emma Ashford from Cato Institute, she shared an article from Reuters where the Russians would go into in Dagestan and Chechnya, the Muslim population, and the FSB would go to these families and go, well, we know that you're a jihadi, so either we kill you now or you go to Syria and we'll kill you there. And so, and they paid for, these people's flights and they go have, so, but everyone had fun. They got to kill each other in the Middle East. But I think this kind of table that I'm showing kind of illustrates kind of this misunderstanding of Russia in itself. We had certain expectations, and then the outcome went completely the opposite direction.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. You would think that this would introduce a little bit of humility into the thinking and discussion of what to expect internationally in general with regard to consequences, but also with regard to Russia. That every time they expect something, they get the opposite result. Can we stick on Syria for a second? Syria is kind of another place of, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but it is a kind of another place of a proxy war between the United States and Russia. At least they have both funded and supported groups in there. Now, this is seen as, anything from the non-interventionist position, saying that we're on the side of Assad, that all this stuff, that kill people, all these, accusations. But Russia has a very direct interest and a geographic interest, as you just mentioned, in intervening in Ukraine. Again, it doesn't make it right. But the Russian troops and the Russian influence there, or the funding of the Assad regime, has been the greatest bulwark against ISIS in that region. And the United States, under the Obama administration, had been giving arms and money to this group of moderate rebels, trying to get them to overthrow the Assad regime, even though we knew they were jihadis, even though we knew they were radical Islamic terrorists, even though we knew they were all these bad things that we say we're against and fighting a war on terror against. The Obama administration and Congress and others were funding these guys, and then it blows up in our face. They become long story short, the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, in that region. Can you comment on that a little bit more and what Russia's role is with regard to Syria?
It was, as I was saying, it's to prevent the terrorists from going back into the Caucasus. That's the main objective.
Yeah.
Also, it's also a political coup, a domestic win for Putin to go, look, we're still a geopolitical player on the international scene where we were able to, take on terrorists and preserve with the limited resources that they had compared to the United States and its allies, essentially preserve the Assad regime. Also, to comment on what you were saying earlier, there's an article from the Telegraph that was "How Arab is the Syrian Arab Army?" And guess what region of the world most of the SAA fighters are from?
I'm guessing very little, or is it?
Though very few. They're Eastern European Muslims, and so they instead of answering al-Baghdadi's call to join ISIS, they went and joined the Syrian Arab Army to fight Bosnian veterans and some people from Kosovo as well. So it's kind of an interesting little trivia to add on to this complicated saga. But in the main point is that Russia views Syria as a strategic point to prevent the spread of Islamic terrorism within his region again, because essentially it's in the backyard, right? Dagestan and Chechnya are just to the north of the region. Plus, you have Turkey right on the border of Syria, where all those terrorists, going in and out. Then you have the Balkans just north of Turkey. So from the Russian perspective, strategically having a more secure area with a stable Assad regime is in their best geopolitical interest.
Well, just looking on a map, I mean, Syria, most Americans, I don't know if I was faced with this region, if I could point out Syria directly on a map, because it's not in my backyard, but in comparison to Russia, it's a lot closer to what was their territory. So imagine if this stuff was going on in Mexico or something like that, that would be more akin to.
Or even like Central America or, like the north part of South America.
Right, a little further away from us.
But it's still the point remains is like that instability will then find its way up to your borders over time, and they would rather that not, happen. And it kind of, as you can see through this, table, it just shows how the establishment's expectations, right, are just completely wrong. And it all kind of stems on this assumption of regime type, of what type of government Russia has. And it's kind of interesting. Oh, well, Russia has, weak autocracy. Okay, it's going to be more aggressive. And yet, right, in some cases, it's assertive, as it would assume to be, but also there's cooperation, right? And like the 1980s, right, was Gorbachev, or 2000s was helping with after 9/11, or even helping President Obama with the Iran deal. So it's just this, for them, they're all just confused by this, because it's the belief that Russia is autocratic, therefore illiberal, the enemy of the West. But then in some cases here it is cooperating. So I think it's kind of important to kind of reiterate this point again, not to beat a dead horse, but just to show, the viewer, this is very highly important to consider. It's not just, you can't just look at the regime type of government.
Right, and make predictive suggestions about what we know it's going to do or not do, or how it's going to behave. Regime type is only one variable in many variables. But this just shows that that these are the people who are supposed to be the wise leaders who know more than us, are smarter than us, are wiser than us, make decisions in our best interest, and that they know all these things, and that they're making the right decisions. And then two guys on a YouTube channel sit down and look, okay, yeah, here's this table from an article we read, and and we can see it because it's just not being locked into that one way of thinking that the foreign policy establishment has to follow a rule of faith, that we demand primacy and that regime type determines foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I think we have to have a more more tolerant view of things and consider how history and culture works, right? I think we kind of point one you kind of already mentioned at some, well, really both of those points. Then I kind of reiterate again the part about orthodoxy, but yeah, essentially we have to look things more in a historical cultural context instead of just within a regime type, because if not we're going to be in always for a surprise, because we're going to expect certain things to happen, right? And then things don't happen. We always left going, what happened, right? Kind of like all those memes on the internet, that there's this article like 5 years ago saying, oh, look at this event, it's going to be a great thing, and then 5 years later it's like, what happened? This was supposed to be X, and then Y happened. And so kind of to conclude, I think to understand Russia, it's important to understand its historical context, or kind of the historical contingency, embodiment of culture, language, history. Because Russia has, history with Poland, with the Mongols, with the Turks, with the French, with the Swedes. And it's important to understand all these different rivalries, because if you don't, then Russians kind of, you wouldn't be able to understand Russian paranoia to cooperate with all these different actors. And also, more or less, kind of reiterating, kind of beating a dead horse again, there's a need to understand the other side, not just assume that universal ideals will just trump everything else, because we just assume, oh, we kind of plop democracy or democratic capitalism on a society, everyone will just act rationally like a drone, and everything will be peaceful. But in reality, right, there's a historical context in how norms are developed, and how hierarchies in society are. In democracy or anarchy or whatever type of system that you have is going to be molded within that historical cultural framework. And I think that's the biggest flaw with the 90s with Russia, because we have those Harvard guys going over to Russia trying to teach them capitalism. But right. Instead, it evolved into an oligarchic system, which had to lead to Putin essentially restoring a Tsar Russia again.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like you try to lay this framework over capitalism, but if capitalism gets in the hands of state powers, it becomes crony capitalism. It becomes, and I think what you said is a good note to end on. The historical background to these things is so crucial, and it makes me wonder if the United States, we have 400 years of history. I mean, if you want to take it back to Jamestown, but we don't have thousands, kind of like that Russian region does, of going back centuries and centuries of time and development. But just to kind of put it in perspective a little bit, in an American way of thinking, yes, universal ideals, they matter, but it takes time and culture and things to develop those, and for those to change. In reality, America borrowed a lot from the British government and Western liberalism thousands of years of development to create this kind of system that it has with its action. But it's kind of like, I thought of two examples as you were saying that with regard to just the history, the culture, those things. It's like, well, if we believe that people have basic human rights, that life, liberty, and property, we believe in John Locke, his writings, Thomas Jefferson, Western capitalism, individualism, why can't we just give this to these people and they just get it? But think of something like slavery. Slavery technically ended in the United States in a legal sense in the 1860s. That didn't mean that the race relations before that, during that time, and after that were going to just be, oh, you know what? Now that slavery is over, I view this individual as just that, as an individual with basic human rights, the same as me, equal before God and the law, and that everybody just started thinking this way. It's also like, if there are a lot to criticize about prisons, but I mean, we just say, okay, well, if we just freed all the people from the prisons, maybe they would be thankful and kind of think the way we do about all these things and freedom and self-responsibility and all this stuff. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Russia has a long history and culture that I think culture is one of those underappreciated realities today that want to say, oh, I don't have a culture. It's just it's just, we're just right. Our culture is right. In the sense that we have universal rights and ideas, and that they should, everything else is just going to fall in line once people understand that.
Yeah, there's this kind of, to apply it more into like an Austrian, sense of things, from the new thinking in Austrian political economy, just talking about capitalism in general. That capitalism can take a variety of forms. Each form of capitalism is animated by a particular culture. And the culture of modern capitalism in the West is consistent with the ethical basis, in Protestantism, right? It's just like the kind of the Western culture, the descendants of the Catholic Protestant kind of schism, kind of influences the way our economic issues are. Whereas in Russia, right, orthodoxy is more communal. That's probably kind of helped explain why they were more kind of receptive to Lenin's version of Marxism. And even now you see they're kind of adopting the social market system, where it's kind of this hybrid between socialism and capitalism. And I think it's important for us to kind of look at how culture kind of influences how people act, not just in a foreign policy sense, but in an economic and political sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll end with this quote that I heard the other day posted on Facebook, because I thought it was clever, that just with regard to history, that we all know the cliche, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, and then those who do know history are doomed to watch as others repeat it. So that's kind of where we are, unless there's some major changes. But
exactly.
Anyway, all right, let's bring this to an end. Hit that little stop broadcast.